Post. I guess you stopped my video, Rosie. Let's switch. Hi, everyone. Hi. Having a little technical difficulties here, but we'll figure them out. Appreciate you joining us today, and I think we have some important information to convey. As we go through this, if you have questions, there'll be some time at the end for questions, comments. Frankly, I'd like to hear kind of some of within the vehicle marketplace, some of the issues that you're seeing. That helps inform a lot of what we're doing on the Hill and other places to try to improve the situation. This session is going to focus on kind of an update on what's happening in both the big and small bus marketplaces, some of the trends we're seeing, some of the key issues that all came out around the same time that we were gratefully invited to a White House gathering that was focusing on clean bus. Lastly, my hope here is that we can start to work towards solutions. That's really the critical thing right now that we just have been missing from for a while is, I don't know, 2021, since the onset of the pandemic, we've just seen enormous price increases for all types of rolling stock. We're in a situation right now that I think it's important to acknowledge. It's and I hate to use the phrase because it's been overused so much, but it's really unprecedented. On the big bus side, in the last 8 years, we've gone from 11 manufacturers down to 2. Some of you who know me know that one of my previous jobs here was putting out a magazine back when associations like this used to do that. And within that magazine, there was we did a buyer's guide. So I decided just to go back 25 years and look at who was listed as manufacturers. And it was sad, frankly, to see an industry that in 1999 had 22 manufacturers of body-on-chassis or cutaway vehicles. And now we estimate 2 to 3 left. So that's the manufacturing side. I don't have to tell any of you who are buying buses what kind of price increases you're seeing. They are significant. They are above what any of us would kind of peg to any inflationary rates. I have members calling state DOTs that I've chatted with will tell me, hey, we've got a bus order and we're at a 60% increase for the same vehicle from the last order. And I almost feel foolish saying to them, well, hey, you're doing well. Because we have members that are at 100 and 100+% price increases happening. So, we're seeing that. And the other thing that I think in kind of environmentally, or what we're looking at, is the attempted solutions that we'll talk through that you probably saw in both the Dear Colleague letter that came out earlier this month, that is kind of consecrated into what we see as the bus facilities and low-no NOFO that also came out earlier this month. We're attempting to provide some relief. FTA certainly is, but I think it's important, and I find myself probably folks from the FTA might consider me a broken record, because I want to remind them that there's a big difference between the solutions that can come into urban systems buying 40-foot coaches, battery, electric, and otherwise, and rural systems looking for body-on-chassis vehicles, looking for accessible minivans. The markets are different. the marketplaces are different, and the ways to come up with solutions, I think, and I think many of you will agree, are different. So real quickly, we've already talked about it, but pauses here, in talking to the manufacturing base, the supply chain issues continue to be real, and they are causing problems. They're not problems that can't be solved, but the idea that we are now, well, tomorrow's March 2024, and we can all remember March of 2020, 4 years ago, at the onset of a pandemic that kind of turned the supply chain on its ear. We're 4 years away from the start of that now, and there's still residual issues that are ongoing. And I think we're going to have to get to a point where we recognize that maybe some of those things weren't temporary, but they're more permanent. Certainly, there's the regulatory environment. There is it's not a secret that procurement is the #1 finding when FTA does oversight issues, that procuring vehicles, whether you're a state DOT or a system doing them, this is a challenging environment to work in. And our procurement processes are equally challenging and complicated, and I think sometimes more than they need to be. You've got fragmented purchasing power. Smaller CTAA members aren't buying hundreds and hundreds of buses. They're buying in smaller quantities, and I think our buying power as an industry has been reduced, particularly when you look at the ability to attract more Ford chassis into the mix so we can build more cutaway buses. Ford's been very clear with us that they're not going to increase that number. And so what's coming into the marketplace now is what we're going to see. On top of all this, we've had this transition through regulation and through others to zero and low emission vehicles that I don't think we should just breeze past. That is a sea change. It's a sea change for the manufacturing base. It changes parts. It changes supply chains dramatically, and would have been difficult to accomplish in a normative environment. But trying to accomplish that while we are suffering through supply chain issues, it's real. So, and again, use the chat feature and drop questions, comments. I'll kind of hit those as I go, but I want to make sure that you get what you need out of this session. On the 7th of February, we were really grateful. We were CTA, and I was a representative for CTA, was invited over to a meeting at the White House. That meeting was largely focused on the big bus issue. Okay, I had participated in APTA's bus task force, which had, I think, 3 meetings prior to that, and that meeting at the White House was kind of like the concluding event in that task force. And for the most part, we had vehicle manufacturers expressing their concerns about their current finances, and no one who was participating in those meetings would have been surprised to see the kind of advance and progress payment issue coming in, and we'll talk about that. There was a lot of good information shared throughout those meetings from the manufacturing side, speaking to what I think most of us would feel were excessive amounts of bus specialization, customization. One of the manufacturers said that in the last calendar year, they had 27, they had specified and had to meet specifications for 20 different shades of white on the inside of their vehicles, that kind of thing. And them talking about how the elongated process of building a 40-foot battery electric bus and how much funds they are holding on to, waiting to get paid at the very end of that chain. There's a lot of good discussion about that. And there was some discussion that finds its way into mostly the bus NOFO about customizations and specializations and ways to, I guess, right size that. You know, CTA members have been telling me throughout this process, you know, they're amenable to reducing specialization. They're also in some cases amenable to progress and advance payments, but rightfully they're asking, well, what do I get for that? Can I get a lower price? Can I get quicker turnaround time, quicker delivery of that bus? And that's yet to be seen. I don't know that we have an answer to that, but I think by the end of this cycle, we're going to start to better understand that. You know, I think the loss now, I know they have come back out of bankruptcy protection, but Proterra entering bankruptcy 9 months ago, Novabus a couple months prior to that, leaving the American marketplace, Eldorado National, the announcement. These have all been kind of precipitating events that I think brought more focus and heat to these sessions at this bus task force. And again, work their way into something that the entire industry is looking at right now, which I'll talk about next, which is the Dear Colleague letter and the bus NOFO. In the Dear Colleague letter, I think there's a couple of issues that I wanted to highlight for you. One is the idea that FTA is saying you are allowed to modify contracts for price increases, use of federal funds. They actually provide in the Dear Colleague letter, some ideas of clauses that they want, that you are allowed to use in procurements that would provide for some of that flexibility. And, both small and large members of CTAA have brought to me dozens and dozens of stories of arriving at the finish line and now the prices have changed. State DOTs have said the same. Last time we surveyed them, some of our bigger members that are buying directly are saying the same thing. How do you adjust for these price increases, but do it in a way that keeps you compliant with FTA regs? And I think the first pieces in that Dear Colleague letter are speaking to that. The second portion there was really highlighted in the bus task force, which was these advance and progress payments. And let's talk about those for a second. FTA has for a long time allowed both of those in construction projects and also in the purchase of rail cars. So some of what they are bringing now into the bus industry is an acknowledgement in the bus procurement space that flexibility that they have allowed in other places needs to now be brought into the bus space. And the rationale, for instance, with rail cars was that, hey, these things cost over $1 million now. And so does a 40-foot battery electric bus. So I think that's the discussion. Most of that in these task force meetings were very large transit agencies, your Seattles, your Philadelphias, that were talking about buys in the hundreds of buses and talking about how they had already engaged in this. And we had some members as well that spoke to me about ways that they had done some of this. Typically, the flow they were talking through was a 15% advance payment, 35% dropping in typically for a battery electric bus when the battery drops into the vehicle, and then a 50% held back for final delivery. The remaining big bus manufacturers need this. They spoke to that very clearly, gave us a lot of data, and spoke to kind of the float that they're assuming when they've got massive buys like this that take double the time they used to, they're holding that, and the interest charges and other things were pretty significant. So the concern I have, and we'll get into some of the concerns, but I wanted to raise this right away, because many of you are probably thinking, well, I don't want to do these payments. And FTA has been very clear, you don't have to. This is not a requirement by any means. Many state DOTs in state purchases, by their own state procurement codes, are not allowed to do these things, which is a concern for me. And we'll speak to that in a bit. And the last thing in that dear colleague that's covered is some discussion about performance-based specifications and state procurements. And I think what we're seeing here is an attempt from FTA, and it's a reasonable attempt, to try to get smaller purchases batched together to increase their buying power into bigger purchases. And we'll speak to that in a second. Now, if you are an operator of vans, body on chassis buses, you know, the issue has never been brought to us by any of the small bus manufacturing space on the need for progress payments. That has not been an issue that has been raised. As well, I'm not so sure that we've been dealing with issues around customization and over specialization in the specifications. But so you're seeing that these solutions outlined here, I think, are largely in the bigger bus space right now. Alongside the dear colleague letter came the notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO, for the combination of 5339 low and no emission buses, funded at $1.1 billion, and then another $390 million into the portion of Section 5339 that is bus and bus facilities. Like they did the past year, they combined those into one NOFO. And those proposals are due the 25th of April, so there's some time here. And frankly, the time is going to be needed. And the reason I say that is because FTA speaks to a couple of priority considerations that they're going to give to applications for buses. And these applications, it's important to look at what these priority considerations are going to be. And the first one is, and there's a phrase that's used in both of these priority considerations that, for lack of a better term, I want you to consider. One is, they say, identify an intent. So they don't say in here, you've got to be part of a joint procurement. It says, your application must identify an intent for a joint procurement. Okay, so now let's move to the second of these priority considerations, where they say, identify an intent to use contract terms that provide funding to manufacturers earlier in the process. Identify intent. I'm trying to get a little bit more clarification from FTA, and we'll share that with members about what exactly that means. But go back to the first one now. Identify an intent for a joint procurement, which they think will reduce specialization. They want to see at least 3 transit agencies using a common vehicle spec set to buy a bus. Now, those of you who may buy off like the Virginia joint procurement or the Washington State joint procurement, you may already be seeing this and doing this. But I think what we're hearing here is the idea of batching together smaller purchases in terms of numbers to get more buying power. The other thing in that first priority consideration they ended with was, or the commitment to use a standard vehicle model, which is like not something that CTA's members in my discussions with them have felt really good about. They've kind of all said, well, what is that? What is the standard vehicle? And in a initial meeting with FTA, the answer was you work that out with the manufacturer. So if the manufacturer tells you you've spec'd a standard vehicle, then there you have it. Again, as we talked about a second ago, the second of these priority considerations was the intent to use contract terms that would provide an advance or a progress payment. They say something earlier in the production process. So the concerns I have, before we get into, I see there's some good questions coming in, which is great. The concerns I have is, well, a state looking to buy and we've had increasing in every one of these NOFOs, more state purchases, which is great to see. They may not be allowed to do an advance or a progress payment and won't be able to avail themselves of this priority consideration. What if in the time, we do have until April 25th, but that time goes quickly, maybe you can't identify 3 other transit agencies to do a joint procurement with. I take these priority considerations seriously. They were the focus of a lot of these meetings. And at the end of these meetings, the kickoff was to send out these 2 pieces. It's hard for me to think that FTA isn't taking these seriously. And they are direct responses to what was being said in this task force. So that's a concern. I'm also very concerned, and I think we should all be, in the big bus space, probably the small bus space too, with just the overall manufacturing capacity in the United States right now. 2 manufacturers of 40-foot buses. There's some wiggle room there where Proterra comes on board, where another vendor may finally be coming through some of the Buy America pieces. But for all practical purposes, we're looking at 2. BYD, I think, is going to be okay, but it's really hard to get past, the politics of that being certainly a Chinese-owned firm. We need the vehicles. So with 2 manufacturers in that big bus space, what's their capacity versus the need? And one of the things that we're working and I'll be chatting with FTA next week about is all of you as states and as operators file asset management plans. We should be able to know pretty clearly what's needed to keep a state of good repair in the industry. How many buses, literally? How many are coming due? How many do we need? And I think looking at that number alongside looking at, the capacity for the limited number of builders to how many buses can they put out in a year? We need to understand those data points, and we need to enter those data points into these discussions for sure. Again, I mentioned I'm worried about state rules. And we've had other members that are direct recipients that basically have said, I am not going to do progress payments. I don't want to do that. Rightfully, I've seen 2 or 3 bus manufacturers go bankrupt or leave the industry. What happens if I'd already put 50% in? Where does that leave me? One of our members said, this seems like a really good way for me to lose my job. I think on the smaller vehicles, I'm increasingly hearing there are body on chassis buses available. And, I think this same kind of high-level roundtable that was held largely focused on big buses, CTAA is strongly considering at our expo this year, kind of having a similar kind of gathering of the smaller bus space. And I really think that we just need, CTAA does as an association, and to best represent you, our members, we need to get a sense of what should we be articulating and arguing for here right now. I don't believe we're in the same space we were 2 years ago where there were just no chassis to be had. But I still hear from a lot of states and a lot of our members on real challenges. and we need to address those. CTA's board, some of whom have joined us today, they charged us as an organization within this kind of crisis, particularly for the smaller vehicles. They charged us with, one, let's use this crisis to improve, streamline, simplify the procurement process, which is a broad goal, but one that we have taken very seriously and we're working on. And the second thing they charged us with was, we need more manufacturers. If we're gonna, I don't know if we're gonna ever bring down prices. You know, many of you are probably cynical like me. Once something spikes up in price, it never falls nearly as quickly, if at all. But to put the pressure in the system to continue innovation, to control the costs of these vehicles, we need more manufacturers. And I think those two data points I just mentioned will show that the manufacturing capacity doesn't match up with the demand. So those are some of our concerns. I'd like now to start to address some of your questions. We're about halfway through here. So Rich Sampson asked, hey, we've heard a lot about customization as a major source of cost increases, but rightfully, he says, for rural, tribal, specialized, and small urbans, are they really customizing that much? And he thinks it's dubious. And I'm going to tell you, Rich, I agree. I have yet to hear that the 75% price increase on a body on chassis bus that a state or one of our members is seeing is directly related to over customization. I don't think, and again, anybody out there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's true. So whereas I think that may be a solution point in the bigger bus industry, I don't think that is for the smaller. And it's another example of what I've been trying to articulate, which is solutions in the big bus marketplace are much different than solutions in the smaller one. And I'll start to address Michelle's question here. She mentions Ford. And I think Ford is a really good example of the difference. If you are Gillig, the only people you're selling your buses to are public transit agencies. We've got to be 100% of their market. What percentage do you think body on chassis buses are for Ford? I'm going to gather less than 1. And right there, you can see the difference and why the solutions are going to be different. Michelle asks, and there are no silly questions, Michelle, why is Ford allowed to cut production? And my answer to that, it may seem cynical, but it's because they're a private sector company and they want to make money. And they perceived from a business perspective that making these wasn't going to truly help their bottom line as they were moving through and coming out of the pandemic. We've leaned on all the way up to the Secretary of Transportation, who on Transit's behalf has talked and brought. So we've had Secretary Buttigieg, FK leadership, all having meetings with Ford. And I think we've got to a point now where the best thing I'm hearing about the marketplace for the smaller vehicles is, hey, we're not adding to the backlog, which at its worst point seemed to be somewhere around 20 to 25,000 vehicles in backlog. But they're also very quick to say, but I don't think we're cutting into it either. Which is a concern. So thanks, Michelle. Tim Bates out in Corvallis, Oregon, asks us, hey, are a lot of agencies walking back their plans to fully electrify their fleets because of the issues Scott describes? And I think the answer to that is yes, Tim. I think there's the smaller you get, and Corvallis for CTAA is one of our big members. You guys are operating big buses, Oregon State University campus. But I think that there's a general growing appreciation that the smaller the agency is, the more it's gonna need to take steps to get towards a complete fleet transition. And I had a member approach me at Rich's executive director at SWATA at the meeting, and he held a couple weeks ago in Tulsa, and say, she said, I'm increasingly thinking that I'm better off supporting and investing my time and energy in building up the charging infrastructure in my service area. And then after that hits a certain point, going after the vehicles. And I said, that is a very wise approach. But look, there are some very aggressive timetables that our rural systems and smaller agencies in California have to have a fully transitioned fleet by 2030. And they're not going to go on record in saying it, but I know for a fact they're very concerned about their ability to make those goals and hit those targets. And, the smaller the agency, and in the urban space, Tim, and Corvallis is a smaller agency, the less you can afford to make a mistake. And if you're going to get a vehicle, it better operate. You better be able to keep it running, and nobody wants to have fleets that are wonderfully zero emission but are also parked and not operational. Michelle, this is the story that keeps me up in your next question. What happens to transit when we can't get buses? That has never been an issue in my 35 years working at CTAA. And that question is now on the table. That's a first. You're not asking a rhetorical question there, and that's not super alarmist. That's very real, and one that we need to deal with. And I think that's what's driving FTA to take these steps of these priority considerations and bringing this flexibility in. But we need to figure out what those steps are in the smaller bus space that can help us as well. And they are not going to be the same ones, as we said, but that question is a real one that needs to be addressed. And my concern, and probably many of your concerns, is I'm going to have to reduce service. I'm going to have to pull service off the streets because I don't have enough safe, reliable vehicles. And we all know in the rural sector, man, you got an 80-mile one-way dialysis trip, or a trip with a real frail senior or a group of seniors. You don't want to be doing that in a bus that you can't rely on in a Midwestern winter to get back safely. So I appreciate that. Kevin writes, I understand the market force issues and appreciate the effort to provide some flexibility and relief. But if my state procurement office decides that progress payments, for example, are in violation, it hasn't really solved stuff. Exactly. I agree with you, Kevin. We're raising that with FTA. And I'm really concerned that they've put a priority consideration out there that almost seems to work against itself. They want state procurements, but they're not taking into account that some state procurement laws don't allow for the other priority consideration. I would urge you to communicate directly with that. Michelle asks, who has the power to make changes, and what are they doing, if anything? This goes all the way up the chain. Congress, the White House, the highest levels of government are looking into this. So I would tell you, Michelle, that the right people are looking at it. They're energized. I think they understand that previous question you asked, what happens if we can't get buses, is now on the table. And it's a time that changes are going to happen. The question is, how do we make sure that the changes don't come alongside with a lot of unintended consequences? that are harmful to you and your operations. The always dreaded anonymous attendee asks, is El Dorado now fully out of the large bus market? My understanding is the El Dorado manufacturing will kind of shut in October. That's what we're looking at. I'm going to skip a little bit down. Eddie Thomas asks, it's interesting to see that these two industries collide, manufacturers who are profit-driven and agencies that are, service-driven. And he's right. And that's where, as frustrated as you may be with these price increases, we've got to engage with the manufacturers as partners here. We've got to, and that was what was so, I think, productive about those big bus task force meetings, was you had the manufacturers in the room with a lot of agencies, and they were working through issues. And, my sense was that's what CTA needs to do in this space, is do this. See, where else are we? Michelle says we are already using a standard vehicle model. I agree. And there's only one option for a cutaway, an option for a Ford Transit. I agree. And, I was only half kidding Michelle when I was talking to some folks at FTA recently, and I said, hey man, we're going to have to teach all CTA members how to do sole source contracting, because there's only going to be one group out there who's making some of these vehicles. And I said that somewhat facetiously, but only somewhat. Julia Castillo from Herta in Iowa asks, what are some solutions to bring small bus manufacturers back to the marketplace and to give government contracts a fair share of the market? It's always better to deploy, Julia, I think, a carrot than a stick. And there's been some ideas about like forcing GSA to get involved, even to look at some of the kind of defense contracting priorities. Those are out there. I think, and I know you, Julie, have been very involved. I think the idea in the smaller bus space of just getting more manufacturers into the space is just critical. So I'm going to go. Delilah from New Mexico asks, could the administration focus on the low aspect of low? No. Well, we worked with them to guarantee that of that 1.1 billion, 25% has to be, as a floor, has to be separated out for low. And I think I'm glad you raised that, Delilah, because I want all CTA members out there to understand that within this NOFA, there is a minimum of about, I'm not the world's greatest mathematician, but I'm going to go $260 million on the table to buy low emission vehicles. And I think for a lot of CTA members, getting into hybrids is maybe that good first step into the electrification piece. We've got a lot of members that do super good with propane and CNG, and these low technologies are very low. And that's one thing I've also wanted to kind of focus some of the research around, is this idea that what we say is zero, it isn't. I could point you to a lot of CTA members that have bought zero emission battery buses and have diesel heaters on the buses to increase the range of that bus. It's no longer zero. Let's talk about where the electricity is generated and how that's generated. And then we can look at other forms of energy that are very efficient. They're not just low, they're very low. And in many ways, I start to wonder if all of these energies aren't all some variation, as you raised, Delilah, of low. But I would encourage CTA members to use those funds that we worked hard to separate out of this for your entree into some of these things. And we've got states that have done really good work. I got I got a press release today from a system in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Atlanta, who is announcing that they're fueling their vehicles through methane piped out of a landfill. Somehow that wouldn't qualify as zero emission. But it seems to me that if we're using methane from a landfill to fuel a vehicle, we're certainly doing what we should be doing. Mary Ellen says, I have heard that FTA is about to issue a Buy America waiver for a small electric bus. Any word on that? I think FTA has had its piece with that Buy America waiver, and I think from their perspective, it was approved. There's a secondary piece right now, which is FTA has to shuttle that up to the White House Buy America Aid Department and Made in America offices, as it's known. And they make final decisions on any Buy America waivers, exemptions, this kind of thing. And so I'm concerned about the timing of that announcement. I think it's there. And I know the folks that have led that effort have done and proved in all cases that would be a good addition to the American marketplace. And while you bring that up, Marianne, I think it's important for us to also talk about the notion of Buy America. I did some Hill visits recently with the group that was advocating for largely European-built, small little autonomous vehicles that are having Buy America issues. And I really wanted to learn and see how are they talking about Buy America, which is a very highly political issue. We are in a very highly political season right now. That those are our realities. And I thought they had a really good way of saying it, where they said, we don't want an exemption or waiver. We want a strategic on-ramp to meet Buy America. We want to build it in the US. We want to build it with domestically sourced parts. We just need time. And can't the US DOT, the White House, say, give us benchmarks to hit in a 2 or 3 year process. So at the end of that, we're in compliance with Buy America. We're adding a new manufacturer into the marketplace, more American jobs, all the other pieces we want. That almost seems to me one of those things here in DC where it makes too much common sense, so it has no chance right now in this environment. But I hope that we can get there with that. Michelle says, hey, if Ford's not the answer for smalls, what is? Yeah, Michelle. We asked Congress to look at a 2-year period of Buy North America so we could bring in some chassis that are being built in Canada. That was a non-starter. And you mentioned that you're struggling in services pulled. After this, shoot me an email, Bogren, Bogren @CTAA.org. And if you're pulling service, I'd like to hear about it, because that's the kind of thing that I really need to bring attention to some of these policymakers. So if you wouldn't mind offline sharing that with me, that would be of great use. And then my old friend Dave Marsh says, while larger buses are having electrification issues, our experience with the Ford Transit EV has been positive. I got to tell you, Dave, that's what I'm hearing from members. One of our a board member who followed your terms on the board, Dave, I don't think John was really into electric vehicles, but he said he could get a Ford Transit EV in 3 weeks, so he took it. And when he got it, called me like 3 weeks later, and he's like, this is working real well for me. And I think the Ford Transit EV increasingly is a popular option that systems should be looking at. I'm glad you raised that. And that part of this, the marketplace constraints that we're looking at, Dave operates carts in and around Austin, but in rural parts of Texas, even large rural operators like Dave have parts of their operation that can mesh really well with the range of a Ford Transit EV. It's it's it is a Ford. I would urge members to look at those because I know they're available, and is something that I would think. So thanks. Julia says, could states get together and do larger bus orders? Yes, I think that would be a really interesting concept. I think if you had, I think about Iowa and the Mink region of Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. If there was a regional bus buy, I would have to think that hits the priority considerations really well. The problem there is like, we got to get all this together by April 25th, which seems a long way off, but let's all assure ourselves it's not. Dave says he uses the Ford Transit EVs in microtransit. Perfect application. And many rural systems are moving in those directions and make sense to do that. I think there's one thing in the chat. I want to make sure I don't miss that. Oh, thank you, Rosie, providing my email address directly. So look, we need to make sure that we use this crisis to drive effective change. Okay. And the fact that it's to a point where some folks are having to reduce service and other things tells us that this marketplace demands us to look at things differently. The number of states that I go into recently that are telling me like, hey, we're looking at 12 and 2s. We're looking at minivans because it's really hard for us to find CDL drivers. So, buy smaller vehicles. When I asked that same state, how many of you with the full-size body on chassis vehicles ever fill them? 0 hands go up. So, we've got new operational approaches. Dave was just talking about microtransit. We need to be looking at new ways of deploying rolling stock. We got a member that's operating the Flint Mass Transit in Flint, Michigan, traditional large urban agency. Ed tells me he's buying tons of sedans and providing service in sedans in very effective ways. So I think that's another part of the answer here is looking at your operational reality, looking at your asset management plans, looking at the funding you have available and what's available vehicle-wise, and putting all those data points together in some new approaches. So again, I'm tired of saying things are unprecedented. It's certainly, though, an environment I've never seen. The standard answers that we've always kind of looked to may not be the right ones anymore. But be assured, we're going to keep on top of these things. We're going to keep pushing here in DC for change and for allowability. One of the questions I didn't get to, Eddie Thomas said, hey, they built the Honda vehicle, the Honda minivan in Alabama. And, Honda, Toyota, a couple of the other ones, Eddie, the issue is they don't want to go through the Buy America process. They meet Buy America. They're made in they're put together in the United States. They're over 70% on the domestic parts, but they just don't want to reveal all of their supply chain. That's an issue that we are certainly dealing with. We're going to have some of these approaches operational are definitely going to be discussed at our expo in June in West Palm Beach. I hope to see you all there and we can sit down and talk about some of these things face to face instead of over a computer screen. And I hope by that point too, we'll start to have the makings of an agenda for solutions that we can start to really shop and push here so that we can forestall what we were hearing from Michelle about, hey, I might have to reduce service. So, it's 1:50. We've covered a lot of turf here. If you have questions for me directly, please fire away. And, I hope all of you have a great rest of your Thursdays. And thanks for for joining us today. Take care.